Welcome back to another video. Today's topic comes from the npr.org website. The category for this website article is education. This was posted back on March 1st, 2022, and written by Corey Turner. The title of the article reads, "When colleges defraud students, should the government go after school executives?" The image below the title contains a red background with a superimposed scroll that has green check marks on it up until an investigative person places a magnifying glass over it to reveal multiple red X's. Below the image begins the article. In a shocking investigation, the U.S. Senate declared the federal student loan program, quote, plagued by fraud and abuse, end quote. Its report heaped scorn on for-profit trade schools for serving 22% of federal student loan borrowers, but accounting for 44% of defaults. Quote, the school keeps the student aid money, ... and the student is left holding the bag with a poor credit rating, no job, and no income to repay the student loan, end quote. U.S. Representative Marge Rukema, Republican, New Jersey, declaimed in her crusade against for-profit, quote, bad apples, end quote. Sound familiar? This clamor for accountability erupted back in 1991, more than 2 decades before the epic collapses of Corinthian colleges and ITT Technical Institute cost students and taxpayers millions of dollars in wasted loans and worthless degrees. More recently, in February, the U.S. Department of Education announced it would erase more than $70 million in student loans for former DeVry University students who had been misled by the school's false advertising. Believe it or not, back in 1992, in response to all this hand-wringing about for-profit colleges, Congress gave the Education Secretary a nuclear option: the power to hold leaders of fraudulent colleges, including executives and investors, personally liable for their wreckage. The problem is that 30 years later, the department has yet to use that power. Now, some lawmakers, higher education experts, and department officials argue it's time. Here, instead in the article to the right, is a link to the DeVry University article. Section: Advocates say the Education Department has an obligation to hold school leaders liable. The point of holding the owners of fraudulent schools personally liable for student and taxpayer losses is twofold: to give the government another way of recouping those losses, and, just as important, to discourage the future sale of education snake oil by shaming the sellers. If ever the department could have, and arguably should have, used this power, student loan experts tell NPR it was after the historic collapses of Corinthian and then ITT Tech. That's when department attorneys concluded that both schools had enticed students with false and misleading claims and had committed, quote, pervasive, end quote, misconduct, and that, as a result, quote, the value of an ITT education, like Corinthian, is likely either negligible or non-existent, end quote. Eileen Connor directs the project on predatory student lending, which recently published an exhaustive deep dive into ITT Tech's fraudulent practices. In a news release about that report, Connor said, quote, the loans were the object, not education or career training. It is genuinely shocking that this, quote, school, end quote, was able to fool regulators and accreditors for so long, end quote. End overall quote. After the collapse of ITT Tech in Corinthian, advocates pushed the Department of Education to give eligible borrowers relief from their federal loans, which, along with other losses related to the collapses, cost the U.S. government roughly $1 billion. Why didn't the department use the nuclear authority that Congress gave it in 1992 to hold the school's leaders liable for some of those losses? It's complicated. First, there's the human explanation. When the department helped arrange the sale of Corinthian to a debt collector, Connor says, department officials interacted with its CEO multiple times. Quote, "It's harder to slap a fine on someone you've just had lunch with," end quote. Then there's the resources explanation, that the department can do only so much at one time. Instead of focusing on holding the perpetrators of the fraud accountable, it focused on providing debt relief to their victims, trying to, quote, "ensure that borrowers were being helped on the back end," end quote, says Dan Zibel, who worked in the department's office of the General Counsel from 2014 through 2017. Zibel says the department's rush to use an old legal provision, known as borrower defense, to erase student loans took considerable time and energy. Likewise, any attempt to claw back money from individuals would have taken enormous department resources, with no guarantee of success. Even an effort that recoups millions of dollars from an executive has to be viewed in the broader context of the government's losses. For a school that created, $7 billion in debt over a decade, that's just a drop in the bucket, end quote, says Connor. But she argues that holding executives liable isn't just about recouping losses. It's about creating a powerful symbolic deterrent for future would-be fraudsters. Quote, "I wouldn't just say that they have the authority," end quote, "to go after school executives," says Connor. Quote, "I'd say they have the obligation to do it," end quote. Now out of the education department, Zibel agrees. Quote, "The system should not be that owners get to walk away with the profits and the taxpayers are left holding the liability," end quote, says Zibel, who is now chief counsel at Student Defense, a nonprofit advocacy group, and a vocal proponent of the department finally using its liability authority. Section. There is precedent for government action. Sort of. The Education Department may have resisted pursuing individual claims against the leaders of Corinthian and ITT Tech, but other government agencies did act. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed a civil complaint, alleging that Corinthian's then CEO, Jack Massimino, and Robert Owen, its then chief financial officer, failed to disclose the company's financial weaknesses before its collapse. The complaint, though, was not about harm done to students, but to shareholders. The pair settled with the SEC, which fined Massimino $80,000 and Owen $20,000. That's a small fraction of what each earned from 2010 to 2012. About $9.5 million for Massimino and roughly $2.5 million for Owen, according to documents filed with the SEC, linked here. In a scalding letter to the SEC chairman, a handful of Democratic senators, including Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, called the settlement, quote, "an insult to the victims of Corinthians fraud," end quote. There have also been efforts at the state level to go after for-profit college executives. Section. A for-profit school advocate supports the department using this power in limited circumstances. Even the head of career education colleges and universities, a national association representing many for-profit trade schools, supports the department taking a harder line on what, more than 30 years ago, Rukeyma called, quote, "bad apples," end quote. Quote, "Absolutely," end quote, says Jason Altmaier. Quote, "In any case, that involves substantial fraud or the owner withdrawing capital before a closure, done specifically to avoid liability for the business. They absolutely should be subject to this. That is the reason that authority exists," end quote. Altmaier cautions, however, quote, "If you're going to apply accountability standards, just apply them to all schools in all sectors," end quote. Translation: make sure for-profit trade schools aren't the only kinds of colleges held under the microscope. Perhaps the most notable voice that has called for the department to use this authority is Ben Miller, formerly of the left-leaning Center for American Progress, because he is now a top advisor inside the Department of Education. Quote, "This must change," end quote, Miller wrote in 2019, linked here. Quote, "Any executive from a college that closes precipitously should be financially liable for the damage done to students and taxpayers." the U.S. Department of Education should take back money paid to school executives in salary or bonuses, and instead use it to cover the cost of loan forgiveness and refund tuition paid by students, end quote. Does this mean the Biden administration might be willing to do what previous administrations have not? Section. A top student loan official hints at a new attitude toward failed for-profit colleges. As was the case back in 1991, when Rukima, a Republican, inveighed against fraudulent colleges, so too are a handful of lawmakers again pushing for stepped-up accountability. Quote, this abdication of the department's duties has not only cost taxpayers, but has also encouraged future law-breaking by executives who feel confident they can enrich themselves at the expense of students and taxpayers, end quote. Half a dozen Democratic U.S. senators, including Warren, wrote to then Education Secretary Betsy DeVos in October 2020, linked here. Then came the Biden administration and a little-noticed hearing in October 2021, linked here, during which Representative Bobby Scott, Democratic of Virginia, questioned Richard Cordray, head of the Education Department's Federal Student Aid Office. Scott reminded Cordray that the department has the power, quote, to seek recovery of financial losses against owners and executives, unquote, of fraudulent college programs. Not all executives should be held liable, Scott argued, just the worst, those who profit from defrauding borrowers. Is the department finally willing to go after them? Scott had already sent a letter to Biden's Education Secretary, Miguel Cardona, linked here, asking the same. He even offered a laundry list of schools that could fit the bill. Quote, we see eye to eye on this, end quote, Cordray responded to Scott. Quote, I thought, parentheses, your letter, end parentheses, was a good bit of a kick in the behind for us to make sure we're moving down the road on this, end quote. Cordray suggested the same recently, when the department announced it would provide loan relief to defrauded borrowers, while the school that misled them, DeVry, remains open. Quote, we do intend to try to hold leaders of schools that fail students responsible in every case we can, end quote, Cordray told reporters on the day of the DeVry announcement. On the same call with reporters, Undersecretary of Education James Kval was even more forceful, end quote. Quote, there will be liabilities for the current owners of these schools to deter wrongdoing, not just at DeVry, but everywhere that it might otherwise occur, end quote. In its announcement about DeVry, the department noticeably called out two executives who presided over the company when it misled students about their job prospects after graduation. Quote, senior leaders at DeVry during this time included Daniel Hamburger, who served as president and CEO from 2002 through 2016, and David Paul Dean, who served as the executive vice president and/or president of DeVry University from 2005 through 2014, end quote. Beyond that press release, though, the Biden administration has done no more than previous administrations to hold college leaders and owners personally liable for ripping off students and taxpayers, which is to say, it's done nothing at all. Here ends the article. Below it, at the end, italicized reads, NPR intern Mansi Khurana contributed to this report. End italics. I know this was written back in 2022, and under our current administration, given that the current president held his own very, very own scam college, Trump University, there will probably also be no action as well. That's not to say that we should give up hope. And that's also not to say that nothing can be done. Work continues to be done, and we can see it still being done in exposing colleges and universities that misappropriate taxpayer funds and the ability of federal student loan programs to help students come to their colleges. Work should continue to be done in this regard, and support to the reporters who are reporting on it should be continued. This is something that unfortunately only the government has the power and the authority to stop. Nothing can stop bad actors except people who either have more money or more power or both than them. Or maybe they're hacktivist groups. However, the likelihood is far greater that they will listen, or at least be forced to listen, when the government comes in to lay down the law. Or in this case, to use what powers have been granted to them because of past law. This is something that needs to happen. Going to school, going to college, and knowing that trade schools are also affected, this is both a blue-collar and a white-collar issue. And it affects all children. What also gets briefly mentioned here is that there's shareholders that are involved. Some schools, astonishingly, have not just boards that they answer to, but some of them even get listed on the stock market. That is egregious because then the attention and focus gets turned away from students who need an education and helping the teachers that teach them with the necessary tools to be successful in teaching them. And it instead focuses on monthly profits, quarterly profits, all these profit and loss statements. It would be great to see a law that comes into place that bans the ability of listing a university on the stock market. And for the power of the Department of Education to be used. Students have enough responsibilities and have enough stress. Having this stress them out is one too many burdens, especially considering how often everybody talks about the students being the lifeblood of our future workforce. Then treat them as such and stop insulting them. They deserve better. Maybe education needs to become free and taxpayer subsidized in order for that to happen. Honestly, I think that'll happen before there's laws passed that actually impact these scammy for-profit schools, which is sad. Thanks for watching/listening, and I will see you in the next video.